So my project is on oil extractivism in Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia. So oil and why it's intensively extracted in Latin America. So Latin American region holds around 20% of the world's reserves of oil. The Orinoco Basin in Venezuela has around 18% of those reserves, or approximately 298 billion barrels of oil. There's also some shale oil reserves in Latin America that could exceed around 53 billion barrels of oil. The region accounts for around 13% of the world's oil production. Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia specifically produce more than 85% of the region's oil output. Now, one of the countries that I'm looking at is Ecuador, and Ecuador is located on the west coast of South America. Its landscape encompasses the Amazon, Andean highlands, and the Galapagos Islands. The economy is the 8th largest in Latin America and 69th largest in the world. Some of Ecuador's exports are chocolate, coffee, bananas, and flowers. There are 14 distinct indigenous peoples in Ecuador. And here's a picture of Ecuador as well as the flag. Another country is Venezuela. Venezuela is located on the northern coast of South America. Its landscape features coastline bordering the Caribbean Sea, as well as the Andes Mountains to the northwest. The economy used to be the wealthiest in South America, however, it's now on the brink of collapse due to political and economic crisis. Some of Venezuela's exports include crude petroleum, refined petroleum, and iron ore. There are at least 26 different indigenous groups in Venezuela. And here's the flag as well as the country. And lastly, we have Colombia. Colombia is located in the north of South America and also has territories in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It has the second highest level of biodiversity in the world. The economy is the third largest in Latin America, and the country is the oldest democracy in that region. Some of Colombia's exports include bananas, crude petroleum, spices, coffee, fruits, and nuts. There are around 87 indigenous groups located in Colombia. And here's a picture of Colombia as well as the flag. Now, there are several corporations entering the region. It's a variety of large international companies as well as small local state-run companies. Occidental, British Petroleum, Texas Petroleum, BP Amoco, Exxon, and Enron Corp are just a few of the different international companies that are specifically extracting from this region. There are some other international companies such as Chevron Texaco Corp and Burlington Resources of Houston that have specifically been named as groups that have caused numerous local as well as environmental issues for the region. The several local and state-run companies come from Ecuador, Argentina, Venezuela, and Colombia. The one from Argentina is actually a state-run oil company that has kind of come into the region to go and take oil from these other countries. Now, how local communities are being affected. I have two slides regarding this. This first slide is just on Chevron Texaco, and the other slide is more based off of other companies as well as other things going on in the region that would affect local communities. So during Chevron Texaco's operations in Ecuador, the company spilled around 17 million gallons of crude oil into the rainforest and around 18 billion gallons of toxic wastewater into local lakes and rivers. These actions have led to people in the region developing cancer, birth defects, miscarriages, to the point where miscarriages in that region are 2.5 times more likely to happen, as well as other health problems. Chevron Texaco stated that they did repair and clean up pits that held drilling muds and waste in them, but local communities have stated otherwise. They've just stated that it was a patchwork job and they didn't actually go and repair or clean up anything. The settlers near oil wells found that oil specifically coated the roads, filled waste pools, and sat in people's front yards and puddles. People in those regions, those local communities, have waited for decades for access to doctors, clean air and water, better roads, and schools. However, their pleas for this have not been met. On top of all of that, during the discussions regarding the court case that Ecuador had against Chevron Texaco, some wealthy Ecuadorians tried to make under-the-table deals in an attempt to get contracts to help clean up the mess that was created from this company. Here's some other local communities that have been affected. In Ecuador, the main oil pipeline, SODI, has been attacked repeatedly, and these attacks have led to the death of local people. There have also been repeated kidnappings of oil workers and contractors. In Venezuela, in an effort to get rid of President Chavez, his opposition has led an oil strike, leading to the country to have a standstill regarding their different shortages throughout. And on top of that, protests also occurred in Venezuela over President Chavez, resulting in the death of at least 22 and injury of at least 28. In Colombia, there's been two guerrilla groups that have been asking for ransoms and extorting foreign oil companies. Guerrilla groups have bombed pipelines more than 1,000 times, which has killed quite a few local people. So many holes have been blown in the pipeline, it's been dubbed the Flute. Oil conflict in Colombia has killed thousands and displaced millions since 1985. Only 20% of Colombian oil territory has been explored due to this violence. A lot of people that are guerrillas, though, they join because they have unemployment as well as lack of schools and other basic infrastructure in their communities. So it's kind of a either do this or just be in poverty consistently, don't have the resources that you need, everything regarding that. Then regarding the many holes that have been blown into it, this has led a lot of oil and crude to go and flow into rivers, streams, and other areas. And so that has gone and led to local communities having their cattle lose weight. Rivers have gotten oily. Some people are unable to fish because they don't want the crude to ruin their nets and they can't afford to get new nets. And all their boats that they use for fishing have had oil rings around the holes that they've had to consistently scrub off. And then with the paramilitaries in Colombia, they've intensified their campaign of murdering civilians, especially those speaking out against oil companies. And those people would be teachers, health workers, journalists, human rights defenders, and union activists. And they've been killed in large numbers by these paramilitaries. Indigenous people, as well as peasant communities that lived near the pipeline, have also been displaced because of it. And on top of that, there's been different operations by the paramilitaries, such as Heroic Operation, which has led to people being rounded up at gunpoint, interrogated, photographed, marked, and arrested. But how are Indigenous people being affected? So in Ecuador, CONAI, which is the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, held demonstrations to protest government agreements regarding oil and the United States. Indigenous tribes argue that since they own the land, they get to decide what happens to it. However, Ecuador argues that and says, well, the oil and the gas that's underneath the land belongs to the state, and thus they have to let them in. Within a few years after Chevron Texaco's arrival, hundreds of wells had been drilled in territory claimed by the Cofan, Hunori, and other Ecuadorian tribes. Some tribes did not like the oil companies and want to keep their traditions, even if that means staying in poverty. However, others have tried to welcome the companies in an effort to modernize and improve their communities. The first oil well that was dug in Ecuador was located in an area called the Orient, which is filled with dozens of indigenous peoples as well as missionaries. And within a decade, the jungle was filled with oil wells, roads, and pipelines. And along that same line, with those roads, a lot of native people, not specifically indigenous tribes, but just local communities, have come in and started slashing and burning that region to make little parcels of land for themselves along the road. A lot of the times when it comes to the indigenous tribes and their land being taken over, majority of it was done without payment or consultation, which is directly illegal according to different laws as well as legislation. And so some of the tribes have actually disappeared, like the Tatides, which is a smaller tribe in the region. They've just simply vanished. No one knows what happened to them. The Hurori fled deeper into the jungle. They don't want any human contact, so they just kind of up and left the land they had been working on for years. And then the Kofan specifically had a lot of difficulty finding the food that they would normally hunt, and they've also been trying to deal with a lot of diseases and illnesses that have come because of these different oil companies and different people moving into their area that they had previously not been exposed to. And then in Colombia, the guerrillas have consented to oil drilling on the behalf of indigenous communities, which did not, in fact, want the drilling to occur on their land. Some guerrillas have actually kidnapped and killed U.S. citizens that were visiting one of the tribes, the Yuwa, to help set up education projects, which were very much so needed. The Colombian government has also attacked indigenous communities like the Yuwa who do not want to allow companies to drill on their land. And essentially, the indigenous community there wanted to prevent this, so they set up a roadblock to prevent people and like equipment from getting through. However, the government didn't like that, and so they forcibly fought their way through these indigenous people. And in the skirmish, what ended up happening was 3 children were killed by drowning in the river that was nearby. And so from then on, without any consultation or any sort of monetary reimbursement regarding the deaths or also the land that was taken, the government proceeded to go and escort these different companies in to go and build their pipelines and rigs on the indigenous land. Now, how is the environment being treated during this? Well, while Chevron Texaco was dumping their produced water into streams and jungle, which, due to the high salt content, killed a lot of flora and fauna, the Ecuadorian government consistently was cutting the budget for different environmental programs. And during Chevron Texaco's time in Ecuador, they could have used different methods that were to make waste disposal safer for the environment as well as public health. But Chevron Texaco said that, oh, those methods are quote unquote too expensive to be cost effective in Ecuador, even though the method would have cost only $1 to $3 extra per barrel of oil. The new pipeline, specifically in Ecuador, has led to more companies making bids to drill on the Amazon, further hurting the environment through the construction of roads, pipelines, and potential oil spills, which leads to more slash and burning from local communities. The areas that they're specifically talking about drilling in are all ecologically sensitive jungle regions. So that can very much so injure even more of the forest, and instead of trying to reverse things that people have previously done, like what Chevron Texaco did, all their damage, instead of trying to reverse that, they're just making it worse, all in the name of oil. Some tribes have gotten assistance, though, arguing their cases for foreign governments and companies through environmental groups such as Amazon Watch or Earth Rights International. These groups have also helped organize protests, supply airplanes, and set up meetings. And some indigenous people have turned their fight against oil drilling into an ecotourism business, to the point where they actually have a website that you can see where they are in their fight against these different companies. Now, some companies have responsibly created pipelines in the region and have prevented construction of more roads, and they've done this through really researching the area, figuring out what ways they could go and create the most environmentally friendly site, which means recycling rainwater, using the method to go and treat and then put the used water, the wastewater from their work trying to go and get the oil out, all the waste that's produced, going and treating that and then putting it back into the earth away from the environment as well as local people, which also then pushes more oil out for them. So it's a win-win situation. And then on top of that, when they were building their pipelines and preventing the construction of more roads to prevent slash and burn, a lot of the pieces and machines that they needed, they would fly in with through a helicopter to prevent those roads and that environment from being as affected by them taking the oil out. And then regarding Colombia, guerrilla groups have wreaked environmental destruction in an effort to bomb pipelines. Specifically, around 2.5 million barrels of crude have spilled into the rivers and ranges from repeated attacks on the pipeline, to prevent the government from getting as much money out of it, and also to prevent the different oil companies from getting their share of the profits out of it as well. Now, lastly, how is the economy being affected? So after a military junta took over Ecuador, income taxes were repeatedly raised, operating areas shrunk for Chevron Texaco, and oil prices were constantly manipulated to improve Ecuador's share of profits. This led to a lot of fighting between the company and the state. However, besides the fighting and when the company would refuse to pay the government for the oil that it was exporting, Chevron Texaco actually loaned out multi-million dollars to Ecuador when it came to stuff like natural disasters or just in general. And usually this came with a lot of generous terms for Ecuador, which was kind of surprising. Now, President Chavez of Venezuela helped drive up oil prices by reviving the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which that meant that prices actually went up to $30 a barrel, which was great for the economy, great for Venezuela. However, as time went on, prices for oil went and dropped down to $17 a barrel, which caused an economic slump, preventing Chavez from giving the military more funds and promotions, which led to kind of shaky loyalty by the military. And so they actually tried to go and stage a coup to get him thrown out of office due to that. And also, due to United States intervention, Venezuela was cut off from credit when it came to the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and they stepped in after the military staged a botched coup that led to an economic devastation in the area, as well as no gains or changes regarding leadership in the country. So in other words, Chavez was still in charge. And then the President Pastrana of Colombia has also allowed foreign companies a larger share of profit from Colombian oil operators in operations in an effort to get more investment into the company, as because of all the violence, there's not as many oil companies wanting to go into the region to try and get that oil, even though only 20% of it has actually been drilled. And so oil in Colombia is its largest export, and majority of the profits from state-run oil companies actually go into federal and local governments, or are supposed to, but majority of that money is either invested in guerrillas and paramilitaries or is stolen by officials. So even though some of the wealthiest regions in Colombia get all this money, around 40 to 70% of the people in those regions are in poverty in shacks. And on top of that, the U.S. helped create Plan Colombia, which was created to give U.S. foreign aid and military aid, as well as diplomatic intervention to stop a lot of drug cartels and insurgent groups in Colombia, to go and get more companies in there and help them out. However, a lot of people see this as not just a war on drugs, but also a attempt to go and keep the oil holdings in the region and keep oil flowing to the United States. And this is Chavez as well as Pastrana. And here are my sources. Thank you for taking the time out to watch my presentation.